May 29th, 1453. Constantinople's walls, unbreached for 1,000 years, are about to fall. But here's what no one tells you. The knights and heavily armored defenders on those walls had already survived 2 months of bombardment and dozens of assault waves. They were exhausted, yes, but still standing, still armored, still the finest warriors Christendom could produce. Then Mehmed II sent in his final wave. Within hours, the city fell. The troops who broke that final line weren't knights. They weren't cavalry. They were infantry, the one type of foot soldier that European shock tactics had been designed to shatter for centuries. Except these infantry refused to break. Today, you're going to learn how the Ottoman Sultan built the only professional infantry corps that could absorb a knight's charge, hold formation, and keep coming. And why, for a brief moment in history, the entire logic of European warfare stopped working. But to understand why Constantinople fell, we need to go back. Back to a time when the knight was the undisputed king of the battlefield. Back to a military formula that had worked for 300 years. And back to the moment when that formula met something it couldn't break. The knight problem picture. A European battlefield. Any battlefield. France, 1346. England, 1415. The Holy Land, 1191. The formula is always the same. On one side, armored cavalry. Knights encased in steel, mounted on war horses bred for one purpose, to slam into enemy lines at full gallop. A single knight cost more than a village earned in a year. His armor, his horse, his weapons, his training, all of it represented a staggering investment, and that investment paid off. Again, and again, and again. Here's how medieval battle worked in Europe. The knights charge, the ground shakes. Peasant levies, farmers handed spears and told to stand in a line, watch a wall of steel thunder toward them. What do? They break. They scatter. They run. Not because they're cowards. Because they're rational. These men weren't soldiers. They were conscripts with families, serving their 40 days of feudal obligation, praying they'd survive long enough to go home and harvest their crops. When 1,000 pounds of armored horse came screaming toward them, they did the math, and the math said, run. This is the secret of medieval cavalry dominance. Knights didn't need to kill every enemy soldier, they just needed to shatter cohesion, break the line, start the rout. Once infantry started running, the battle was over. Cavalry would ride them down from behind. What began as a fight became a slaughter. Crécy, Poitiers, Arsuf, Hastings. The names changed, the pattern didn't. For 300 years, European commanders built their entire strategy around one assumption. Infantry will break. Heavy cavalry will shatter them. Victory belongs to whoever has the best armored horsemen. It worked against French peasants. It worked against English ferdmen. It worked against Saracen foot soldiers in the burning sands of the Levant. Why would it stop working now? This was the mindset European crusaders carried into the 15th century, a confidence bordering on arrogance, forged in 3 centuries of cavalry supremacy. When they looked east toward the Ottoman Empire, they saw another enemy to be broken, another infantry force to be scattered, another crusade to be won with the thundering hooves that had conquered everything from Jerusalem to the plains of France. They had no idea what was waiting for them, because while Europe perfected the art of the armored charge, the Ottomans had been solving a different problem entirely. They'd been asking a question that European commanders never thought to ask. What if you built infantry that simply refused to break? The state's infantry. The word meant new troops, Janissary. But there was nothing simple about what that name represented. These weren't mercenaries fighting for coin. They weren't feudal levies counting the days until they could go home. They weren't tribal warriors bound by blood ties that could shift with the political winds. The Janissaries were something Europe had never seen. something that broke every rule of medieval military organization. They were professional state soldiers. Think about what that means. In an age when armies assembled for campaign season and dissolved when the harvest called, the Janissaries trained year-round. When other infantry worried about their families, their farms, their futures, the Janissaries had none of those distractions. They were the Sultan's men, completely, absolutely, from childhood until death. The system that created them was called the devshirme, and it was as brilliant as it was brutal. Every few years, Ottoman officials would travel through Christian villages in the Balkans. They were looking for boys, strong boys, smart boys, boys between 8 and 18 years old. These children were taken from their families, converted to Islam, given new names, new identities, new lives, and then they were trained. Not for months, for years. The most promising became palace servants, administrators, even viziers. But the strongest, the most disciplined, the ones who showed aptitude for violence, they became Janissaries. By the time a Janissary reached adulthood, he had spent more than a decade learning one thing: how to fight and how to stand. No harvest to return to, no family to protect, no divided loyalties. The Sultan was their father, the corps was their family, the barracks was their home. And they were paid, regularly, reliably, in actual money. This sounds obvious to modern ears. Of course soldiers get paid. But in the 15th century, this was revolutionary. European men-at-arms fought for land, for honor, for feudal obligation. Payment was irregular, often late, sometimes non-existent. The Janissaries received salaries from the imperial treasury. They could afford equipment. They could afford to specialize. They could afford to drill. While European infantry trained for weeks before a campaign, Janissaries trained for years before their first battle. While feudal levies practiced holding a spear in a line, Janissaries mastered something far more difficult. They learned to stand when every instinct screamed at them to run. There's a moment in every battle that decides everything. It's not the first charge. It's not the final blow. It's the moment when one side looks at the carnage, looks at the odds, and decides, this isn't worth dying for. That's the moment of breaking. The instant when an army stops being an army and becomes a mob of individuals trying to survive. European commanders had exploited this moment for centuries. Their entire battle doctrine was designed to manufacture it, to create such overwhelming shock that enemy infantry would shatter before the real killing even began. The Janissaries were trained to make that moment never come. How do you train a man to stand when a wall of armored cavalry is thundering toward him, when the ground is shaking, when the men beside him are screaming, when every survival instinct in his body is begging him to run? You can't do it with speeches. You can't do it with threats. You can't even do it with money. You do it with identity. A Janissary didn't stand because he was brave. He stood because running was unthinkable, because the man next to him was his brother, not by blood, but by something stronger, by shared suffering, by years of training together, eating together, praying together, bleeding together. To break formation was to betray that brotherhood, and betrayal was worse than death. This is what European cavalry charges met when they slammed into Janissary lines. Not just disciplined soldiers, not just professional infantry, true believers, men who had been forged in the same fire, who had nothing in the world except each other and their sultan, who would rather die in formation than live as cowards. The knights had never faced anything like it, but discipline alone doesn't win battles. The Janissaries had something else, something that would change warfare forever. They carried guns, not cannons, not siege weapons, personal firearms, arquebuses and handguns that could punch through armor at ranges where a knight was still just a target, not yet a threat. Picture it. You're a European knight. You've trained since childhood for this moment. Your armor cost more than a peasant will earn in a lifetime. You're mounted on a war horse bred for war, and you're charging at infantry. The same infantry your fathers and grandfathers scattered like chaff. Then you hear a sound like thunder. Smoke blooms from the enemy line. And the man beside you, a knight just like you, armored just like you, charging just like you, topples from his saddle with a hole in his breastplate. You're still 50 yards away. Your lance hasn't touched anyone. And you're already losing. This was the Janissary edge. Not just gunpowder. The Ottomans weren't the only ones with firearms, but the integration of gunpowder into a disciplined infantry corps that could reload under pressure, fire in volleys, and then hold the line when the survivors of that volley crashed into them. European armies had handgunners. But European handgunners were specialists, separate units that fired and then got out of the way so the real soldiers could fight. Janissaries were the real soldiers and the gunners. The same men who shot you at 50 yards would stab you at 5, and they'd do both without breaking formation. The Ottomans understood something that would take Europe another century to fully grasp. The future of warfare wasn't cavalry or infantry or artillery. It was all three working together. When the Sultan's army took the field, it moved like a single organism. Sipahi cavalry on the flanks, ready to exploit any gap. Artillery in the center, bombarding enemy positions. And behind those guns, waiting with terrible patience, stood the Janissaries. They were the anvil. Everything else was the hammer. Enemy cavalry charges? Let them come. Let them break themselves against the Janissary line while Ottoman horsemen swept around to take them from behind. Enemy infantry advances? Let them walk into artillery fire, then meet fresh Janissaries who hadn't moved, hadn't tired, hadn't wavered. This was combined arms warfare. This was professional military doctrine. This was the future. And in 1444, Europe was about to learn just how badly it had fallen behind. Varna, the crusade that failed the year, is 1444. The place is the Black Sea coast of Bulgaria. Pope Eugene IV has called a crusade. One more holy war to push back the Ottoman tide. One more chance to prove that Christian knights can still carry the day against any enemy. The coalition that answers is impressive. Poles, Hungarians, Wallachians, Bohemians, and leading them all, the young king. Władysław III of Poland and Hungary, barely 20 years old, burning with crusading zeal. Beside him rides John Hunyadi, the greatest Christian general of the age, a man who has actually beaten Ottoman armies before, a man who knows the enemy. But even Hunyadi can't convince the young king to be patient. Władysław wants glory. He wants to be the king who saved Christendom. And when the Ottoman army appears near the city of Varna, he sees his chance. The numbers aren't in his favor. The terrain isn't in his favor. But he has something the Ottomans don't have, or so he believes. He has knights. The battle begins the way European battles always begin. Cavalry charges, the sound of thunder, the collision of steel against steel. And at first it seems to work. On the flanks, Christian horsemen push back the Ottoman cavalry. The Sipahis give ground. For a glorious hour, it looks like the old formula still holds. It looks like the crusade might actually succeed. But in the center, something different is happening. The Ottoman infantry isn't breaking. The Janissaries stand in their formations, white felt caps bright against the smoke and chaos. They absorb charge after charge. Men fall. Gaps open, and the gaps close again. Every time Christian cavalry pulls back to reform, the Janissary line is still there, bloodied, diminished, but unbroken, still standing. Hunyadi sees the danger. He's been fighting Ottomans long enough to know what Janissary discipline means. He sends word to the king, "Don't charge the center. Don't throw yourself at the infantry. Let me work the flanks." Władysław doesn't listen. The young king sees Sultan Murad II's banner in the Ottoman center. He sees glory. He sees the chance to end this war with a single heroic stroke. He gathers his household knights, the finest heavy cavalry in Eastern Europe. He levels his lance, and he charges directly at the Janissary line. What happens next takes less than 15 minutes. The knights slam into the Ottoman center with all the force 3 centuries of cavalry tradition can muster. They almost break through. For a heartbeat, they're cutting their way toward the Sultan himself. Then the Janissaries close around them like a fist. Władysław III dies somewhere in that chaos. His body is never recovered. Only his head, mounted on a pike, paraded through the Ottoman camp. The crusade dies with him. The Christian army shatters. What began as a holy war becomes a desperate rout. And across Europe, military commanders ask themselves a question they've never had to ask before. What do you do when infantry doesn't break? 9 years. That's how long Europe had to process what happened at Varna. 9 years to study the battle, to analyze the failure, to understand why the old formula had stopped working. They learned nothing. Or rather, they learned the wrong lesson. Varna was a defeat, yes, but defeats happen. The young king had been reckless. The terrain had been unfavorable. The I-4 timing had been poor. Surely it was a fluke. Surely European knights were still the masters of the battlefield. Surely infantry, even good infantry, couldn't stand against the full weight of Christendom's armored might. They would have one more chance to test that theory. And this time, the stakes would be everything. Constantinople. The city that couldn't fall for 1,000 years, Constantinople had been the greatest city in the Christian world. Rome had fallen. The Western Empire had crumbled into squabbling kingdoms. But Constantinople endured. The walls that Emperor Theodosius II had built in the 5th century still stood, massive, layered, seemingly impregnable. The Theodosian walls. Just saying the name sent a message to would-be conquerors. Don't bother. The numbers were almost absurd. A triple line of fortifications. An outer wall 30 feet high. An inner wall 40 feet high and 15 feet thick. 96 towers. A moat 60 feet wide. Armies had broken themselves against these walls for centuries. Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Russians, Crusaders, fellow Christians, had only breached them once, in 1204, and that was through treachery, not force. No army had ever taken Constantinople by direct assault. No army in history. When Mehmed II, the 21-year-old Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, announced his intention to capture the city, experienced commanders on both sides knew what he was attempting. The impossible. But Mehmed wasn't like other sultans. He wasn't like other commanders. He wasn't like anyone. He spoke 6 languages. He studied philosophy, astronomy, literature. He read histories of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, and he didn't just admire them. He intended to surpass them. Constantinople was his obsession. The city haunted him. As a child, he had asked his tutors about the walls, about the defenses, about why no one had ever conquered them. Now he had an army of over 80,000 men. He had a fleet to block, the harbor. He had something no previous attacker had possessed. Massive siege cannons, including a monster called the Basilica that could fire stone balls weighing over half a ton. And he had the Janissaries, 12,000 of them, the elite of the elite, veterans of a dozen campaigns, the only infantry in the world that could do what Mehmed needed done. In April 1453, the Ottoman army arrived at Constantinople's walls. The siege had begun. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine V knew exactly how desperate his situation was. He had fewer than 7,000 defenders to hold nearly 4 miles of walls. 7,000 against 80,000. The math was a death sentence. But Constantine had something Mehmed didn't have: the walls themselves. Those impossible, legendary, unbreakable walls. and he had help. Giovanni Giustiniani, a Genoese professional soldier, had arrived with 700 of his own men, armored, experienced, and spoiling for a fight. Other volunteers had trickled in from across Europe. Not many, not nearly enough. But they were knights, professionals, the finest heavy infantry Christendom could produce. If anyone could hold a wall, it was these men. Constantine deployed them at the weakest point in the defenses, a section of the walls in the Lycus Valley, where the fortifications dipped and the ground favored attackers. This was where Mehmed would come. This was where the city would be saved or lost. The defenders settled in, checked their weapons, and waited. They had no idea what was coming. 55 days of hell. Mehmed's bombardment began on April 6th. The basilica spoke first, a sound like the world ending. A stone ball the size of a man arced through the air and slammed into the ancient walls. For defenders who had never experienced gunpowder artillery at this scale, it must have seemed like the wrath of God. Day after day, night after night. The cannons roared, the walls crumbled, and every night the defenders would creep out and repair what they could, filling the breaches with timber and rubble and earth. By morning, the walls were battered but standing. Then the cannons would speak again. This was siege warfare in its purest, most brutal form. Not strategy, not maneuver, just endurance. Just the question of which would break first, the walls or the men defending them. The first Ottoman assault came on April 18th. Irregular troops, Bashi bazooks, wild and undisciplined, hurled themselves at the breaches. They died in windrows. Giustiniani's men cut them down with crossbows and handguns, then finished the survivors with sword and axe. The irregulars fled, leaving piles of dead at the base of the walls. The defenders cheered. They had held. Mehmed watched from his tent. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't discouraged. The irregulars were never meant to take the walls. They were meant to tire the defenders, to make them fight, to make them bleed. He could afford to spend lives. Constantine couldn't. The second assault came on May 7th. This time, better troops. Ottoman regulars supported by sappers trying to collapse the walls from below. Again, the defenders held. Again, the attacks fell back. Again, the walls stood. But the cost was mounting. Giustiniani had been wounded once, twice. The defenders were fighting in shifts now. 4 hours on the walls, 4 hours of exhausted sleep, then back to the walls again. Food was running short. Ammunition was running short. Hope was running short. The cannons never stopped. By late May, the walls were more rubble than stone. The defenders weren't sleeping anymore. They were barely eating. They moved through the smoke and dust like ghosts, bleeding from wounds they no longer bothered to bandage. And still they held. Because they were knights. Because they were professionals. Because the walls of Constantinople had never fallen to assault, and by God, they would not fall now. Then came May 29th. Mehmed called his final war council on the evening of May 28th. 2 months of bombardment, dozens of assaults, thousands of casualties, and the city still stood. His advisors were divided. Some urged patience. More bombardment, more time. Let hunger do the work. Others whispered about withdrawal. The Venetian fleet might be coming. The Hungarian army might march south. Every day increased the risk. Mehmed listened to them all. Then he gave his orders. Tomorrow. One final assault. Everything they had. The irregulars would go first. Fresh waves of Bashi bazooks to exhaust the defenders. Then the Anatolian regulars, better armed, better trained, to press the advantage. And then, when the defenders were spent, when they had nothing left, when they had given everything they had, and more, then he would send the Janissaries, the Sultan's own household troops, 12,000 men who had never broken, who had never fled, who would rather die than retreat. They would go in at dawn, and they would not stop until Constantinople fell. The night of May 28th was the longest night in Constantinople's history. Inside the city, everyone knew what was coming. There were no secrets anymore. Ottoman drums had been thundering since sunset. Fires blazed across the enemy camp, thousands of them stretching across the horizon like fallen stars. Emperor Constantine V led a final procession through the streets. Orthodox priests, Catholic soldiers, Greeks and Italians who had been enemies for centuries, now united by the simple mathematics of survival. They gathered in the Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom, 1,000 years old, and they prayed together. Orthodox and Catholic. One last time. Constantine spoke to his men. The speech has been lost to history, but chroniclers who survived remembered its essence. Tomorrow we fight for our faith, our city, our families. If we die as free men. If we live in glory. Then he rode to the walls. The defenders watched the Ottoman camp and waited for dawn. Some prayed. Some slept, or tried to. Some simply stared into the darkness, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether 1,000 years of history would continue or end. Across the lines, 12,000 Janissaries were performing their own rituals. Prayers, final meals, the cleaning of weapons, the checking of armor. They knew they would be sent in last. They knew what that meant. They were the finishers, the closers, the men you sent when everything else had failed. And they were ready. The first wave, expendable. The assault began at 1:30 in the morning. No warning, no negotiation, just the sudden roar of Ottoman war drums and a human tide surging toward the walls. Bashi bazouks, irregulars, the lowest troops in Mehmed's army, criminals, adventurers, desperate men fighting for plunder. They had no armor, minimal training. They were fodder, and everyone knew it, including them. But fodder has its purpose. These men didn't need to take the walls. They needed to make the defenders fight. And fight they did. The Bashi bazouks hit the breaches with ladders and grappling hooks, screaming, scrambling, dying. Crossbow bolts scythed through them. Handguns cracked. Swords rose and fell in the torchlight. For 2 hours, the irregulars threw themselves at the walls. They achieved nothing. They weren't supposed to achieve anything. Behind them, Mehmed watched. He saw the defenders fighting with desperate energy. He saw the Bashi bazouks falling in heaps. He saw exactly what he needed to see. The defenders were committed. They were burning through their strength. At 3:30, he signaled the withdrawal. The surviving irregulars fled back into the darkness. On the walls, the defenders gasped for breath. Some collapsed where they stood. Others reached for water, for bandages, for anything. They had perhaps 15 minutes to rest. Then the drums started again. The second wave. Pressure. The Anatolian regulars came next. These were real soldiers, armored, organized, disciplined. Not Janissaries, not yet, but professional troops who knew how to assault a fortification. They hit the walls like a hammer. The fighting at the Lycus Valley became a nightmare of close-quarters butchery. The breaches were so choked with rubble and bodies that attackers had to climb over the dead to reach the living. Torches guttered in the dust and smoke. Men screamed in Greek and Turkish and Italian, their voices swallowed by the roar of combat. Giustiniani was everywhere. The Genoese commander moved along the line like a demon, plugging gaps, rallying defenders, personally cutting down any Ottoman who crested the walls. His armor was slick with blood, some of it his own. The regulars pushed harder. They had numbers. They had fresh legs. They had the weight of an empire behind them. But the defenders held. Barely. Impossibly. by sheer will and the accumulated skill of men who had trained their whole lives for moments like this. By 5 in the morning, the second wave was faltering. The Anatolians had taken horrific casualties. The walls somehow still stood. Mehmed could have stopped. He could have withdrawn, regrouped, tried again another day. Instead, he gave the order he'd been waiting to give all night. Send in the Janissaries. The final wave. They kept coming. The defenders saw them emerge from the pre-dawn darkness, white felt caps, disciplined ranks, no screaming, no wild charges, just thousands of men moving forward in terrible silence. The exhausted knights on the walls knew exactly what they were seeing. They had heard the stories. Some had faced Janissaries before and survived. But they had never faced them like this. Not after 2 months of siege. Not after a night of continuous fighting. Not when they could barely lift their swords. The Janissaries didn't charge. They advanced. Drums beating. Ranks dressed. Like a machine, not an army. They hit the breaches at 5:30, just as the sky was beginning to lighten. And everything changed. The difference was immediate. The Bashi bazooks had been chaotic, easy to read, easy to disrupt. The Anatolians had been brave but predictable. The Janissaries were neither. They came in waves, but the waves had rhythm. Fresh units cycling forward while bloodied units pulled back to regroup. Pressure that never let up, never gave the defenders a moment to breathe. When a Janissary fell, the man behind him stepped over the body without breaking stride. When a defender cut one down, 2 more appeared. When a section of wall was cleared, it filled again within seconds. This was what Europe had never understood. This was what Varna should have taught them. The Janissaries weren't trying to win through heroism. They weren't trying to achieve glory. They were trying to do something much simpler and much more devastating. They were trying to outlast. They were the wave that didn't stop, the pressure that never eased, the enemy that kept coming and coming and coming, until there was nothing left to resist. On the walls, the defenders began to break, not all at once, not in a single dramatic collapse. But man by man, step by step, the line started to give. A defender fell and wasn't replaced. A gap opened and stayed open. A section of wall that had been held for hours was suddenly held by no one. Then disaster struck. Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese commander, the irreplaceable professional who had held the defense together for 2 months, took a crossbow bolt. The wound was serious, maybe fatal. His men carried him from the walls toward the harbor, toward his ships, toward the hope of survival. The defenders saw him go. The man who had rallied them, inspired them, held them together through 55 impossible days. Gone. The line wavered, and the Janissaries felt it. Somewhere in the chaos, historians still argue exactly where, a small group of Janissaries found an open gate, the Kirka Porta, a small postern door in the walls, possibly left open by accident, possibly by retreating defenders. It didn't matter why. What mattered was that 50 Janissaries were suddenly inside the walls. They should have been cut down immediately. 50 men against a city, impossible odds. But 50 became 100. 100 became 1,000. The breach was too small to close, and the defenders were too exhausted to try. Ottoman banners rose above the inner walls. The cry went up, in Greek, in Turkish, in a dozen languages. The city has fallen. The Turks are inside. Emperor Constantine V heard the cry from across the city. The Turks were inside. The walls had fallen. 1,000 years of history was ending in real time. He could have run. The harbor was still open, barely. Ships were still evacuating whoever could reach them. The Emperor of Rome could have slipped away, fled to some Western court, spent the rest of his life as a pretender in exile. He didn't run. According to the chroniclers, Constantine tore off his imperial regalia, the purple cloak, the symbols of office that marked him as the heir to Augustus and Justinian. He became just another soldier in armor. Then he drew his sword and charged into the Ottoman tide. No one knows exactly how Constantine XV died. Some say he fell at the walls, fighting to close the breach. Some say he made it into the streets and died defending a barricade. Some say his body was never identified, just another corpse in the mountains of dead that choked Constantinople's avenues. What everyone agrees on is this: he didn't surrender. He didn't negotiate. He didn't beg. The last Roman emperor died like the first Romans had lived, with a sword in his hand and enemies at his feet. It was the only ending he would have accepted. The city falls by mid-morning. Organized resistance had collapsed. Janissaries poured through the breaches, but the battle was already over. What remained was something worse: the traditional 3 days of plunder that Ottoman custom granted to armies that took a city by storm. The scenes that followed don't bear detailed description. Churches desecrated, homes looted, civilians who hadn't escaped killed or enslaved. The Hagia Sophia, where Constantine and his men had prayed just hours before, became a mosque before sunset. 1,000 years of Byzantine civilization ended in a single morning of blood and fire. When Mehmed II finally entered the city, riding through the shattered gates his Janissaries had opened, he went straight to the Hagia Sophia. He climbed to the highest gallery and looked out over the city he had conquered. According to witnesses, he recited a Persian poem. The spider spins his web in the palace of the Caesars. The owl calls the watches in the towers of Afrasiab. He was 21 years old. He had just accomplished what no commander in history had managed. He had taken Constantinople. And the troops who made it possible, the infantry who broke the unbreakable walls, stood in their formations below, white caps stained with blood and dust and victory. The Janissaries had done what infantry wasn't supposed to do. They had won. Belgrade. The limit. But here's what separates history from myth. The Janissaries weren't invincible. 3 years after Constantinople, Mehmed tried again. Different target, same strategy. The fortress of Belgrade, gateway to Hungary, key to Central Europe. The Sultan arrived with another massive army, another corps of Janissaries, another impossible objective. This time it didn't work. John Hunyadi, the same general who had warned King Władysław at Varna, the same man who understood what Janissary discipline meant, was waiting. He had prepared the defenses. He had assembled a relief force. He had learned the lessons that the dead at Constantinople never got to apply. The siege lasted 3 weeks. The Janissaries assaulted the walls with the same relentless pressure that had broken Constantinople. But Belgrade held. The defenders knew what to expect. Now, they rotated their troops, kept reserves fresh, refused to let the Ottomans grind them down. When the Janissaries pushed, the defenders pushed back. When gaps opened, reserves filled them. On July 22, 1456, Hunyadi launched a counterattack that drove the Ottomans from their siege lines. Mehmed himself was wounded. The army that had conquered Constantinople retreated in disorder. The Janissaries had been stopped. This matters. It matters because the story of the Janissaries isn't a story about superhuman warriors who couldn't be defeated. It's a story about professionalism, about what happens when you invest in training, in doctrine, in soldiers who fight as a unit instead of as individuals. At Constantinople, the Janissaries faced exhausted defenders at the end of a 55-day siege. They faced walls that had been pounded to rubble. They faced an enemy that had already fought off 2 assault waves that same night. And they won. Not because they were invincible, but because they were fresh, disciplined, and relentless at exactly the moment when those qualities mattered most. At Belgrade, they faced prepared defenders with good leadership and adequate reserves. The same qualities that broke Constantinople weren't enough. The Janissaries were elite, but they weren't magic. They were an answer to a specific problem. The problem of infantry that breaks under pressure. They solved that problem better than anyone in the 15th century. But they couldn't solve every problem. No army can. Why this mattered, zoom out. Look at the bigger picture. For 300 years, European military thinking had been built on an assumption. Heavy cavalry wins battles. Knights shatter infantry. Shock tactics break enemy morale. The Janissaries proved that assumption wrong. Not completely. Cavalry would remain important for centuries. But the era of unchallenged knight supremacy was over. Something had changed. Europe noticed. Europe had to notice, because the Ottomans were suddenly at the gates of Vienna and showing no signs of stopping. The response took decades, but it came. Swiss pikemen who could stand against cavalry charges, Spanish tercios that combined pike and shot into formations that dominated 16th century battlefields. The military revolution that would transform European armies from feudal levies into professional standing forces. None of this happened because Europeans read Ottoman military manuals. It happened because they had to adapt or be conquered. The Janissaries didn't just change Ottoman history, they changed European history by proving that the old ways weren't good enough anymore. The legacy. For one crucial generation, Mehmed II had the answer to the knight problem. That answer wore a white felt cap. It carried an arquebus. It trained year-round, fought as a unit, and refused to break no matter what came at it. The Janissaries weren't the first professional soldiers in history. The Romans had legions. The Macedonians had phalangites. Every great empire eventually figures out that trained professionals beat amateur enthusiasts. But the Janissaries were the right professionals at the right time. They emerged exactly when gunpowder was changing warfare, exactly when the old cavalry-dominated battlefield was becoming obsolete, exactly when someone needed to prove that infantry could stand against the finest heavy cavalry in the world. They proved it at Varna. They proved it at Constantinople. They kept proving it for a century afterward. And when Europe finally caught up, when Swiss pikes and Spanish tercios and eventually musket-armed line infantry became the new normal, it was because the Janissaries had shown what was possible. Closing May 29th, 1453. Constantinople falls. The knights and armored defenders did everything right. They held for 55 days. They threw back wave after wave. They fought until they had nothing left. And then the Janissaries came. Fresh, disciplined, relentless. The wave that didn't stop. That's the answer to the question we started with. That's how you break walls that have stood for 1,000 years. That's how you defeat the finest heavy infantry Christendom could produce. You don't do it with better knights. You don't do it with more cavalry. You don't do it with individual heroism or noble lineage or feudal prestige. You do it with professionals. State-backed, year-round, drilled until it's instinct professionals who fight as a unit and stand when everyone else runs. The Janissaries weren't invincible. Belgrade proved that. But for a crucial moment in the 15th century, they were reliable. The one infantry force in the world that could face Europe's best and simply refuse to break. That's what made them terrifying. That's how Mehmed II changed the rules of war. And that's why, 500 years later, we're still talking about the men in white felt caps who stood when everyone else ran.